And we're online. Kent, please start.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of VCTV, where we discuss insights, upcoming trends, secrets in the VC world, as well as connect founders with investors, right to your TV, or for 99% of us, unfortunately, just our computer screens. My name is Ken Makashima, and I'll be your host for today's episode. So today we'll be discussing investments and pivots during COVID-19 pandemic, specifically in the machine learning and data spaces. Lots of interesting activity of late, including the rise and now the IPO of Snowflake, and we have those data warehouses and storage, as well as the never-ending VC hype surrounding GPT-3. So before we get started, love to say thank you to our live audience as always for tuning in. If you have any questions during the episode, please leave a comment below, and Elena will relay it to us so we can ask our speakers live during the episode. If you're a founder or an investor, who would like to be on the show, please still reach out to LA Token team. They'll get you on an episode to share your insights and views. So again, thank you as always to Elena and LA Token for making VCTV possible. Wouldn't happen without you all. So on that note, let's get started and let's introduce today's amazing experts and speakers for today's episode. So to get started, let's go with Isabelle. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Isabelle Friedheim. I have been a fintech investor for a number of years. I have co-founded the London Fund, which is a fintech early stage venture capital fund. And I was for some time with Mission OG, which is an East Coast based in the United States venture capital fund, making investments in B2B IT overall, although I focused on fintech. And I currently have co-founded my own fund, Starwood VC, which still invests in fintech. And right before that, I co-founded a company that is a machine learning and artificial intelligence company called Magnify, that is a natural language search engine for financial products. So that company is based in New York, between New York and Boulder in the US, now at a slightly later stage.
Perfect. Thank you, Isabelle. Next, we have Jenny.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks for inviting me on the show. I'm from Cropery. Cropery is a seed and early stage Nordic fund. So we invest across the Nordics. In our main sectors are sort of health tech and fintech, and just general enterprise software. We've been doing a few data deals now lately, and there is a lot going on in machine learning and NLP in general here in the Nordics. So yeah, we are very excited for this segment of opportunities.
Perfect. Looking forward to hearing your especially your international insight today on the show. Next, we have Marat. Welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marat. I'm with venture fund Good News Ventures. We're located in Toronto, Canada. We're industry agnostic fund. We invest at pre-seed, seed stages. Predominantly North America, Canada, and US. And since we're industry agnostic, AI and ML, one of our areas of interest, especially with machine learning and reinforcement learning, as well as projects in the AGI space in general.
Perfect, thank you. And next we have Dave.
Hi there, welcome to everybody. I'm Dave Edwards. I'm with a firm called Sonder Studio based in Bend, Oregon. I've been involved in the AI space for about 5 years, started a business starting back then and sold it into the media industry. We started up Sonder Studio to work with small companies and help them build products that actually work for people. So we describe our focus as human-centered AI. We're currently working on an AI project in health and in finance, in sports, and in media. So we've got a handful of those smaller businesses going. We also work with very large companies and work with them on AI projects and innovation programs, although that's slightly separate to the topic today, but excited to talk about what's going on.
Awesome, thanks. Quite the variety of industries that you work with. Excited to see the insight there. Next, Marcus, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys for having me. So my name is Marcus. I am a serial entrepreneur. I've worked in segments such as content rights with streaming services, then with fintech for a number of years, and now working on data. I also invest through the Grow VC group, which is, we're a group of serial entrepreneurs that have had the fortune of working together over the past 10 years, sometimes even longer. And through there, we're involved in different types of segments, such as developer first products, a lot in ML, some things in, for example, open source AI for e-commerce, some NLP. There's a couple of things that we hold very dear for, let's say, the next 10 years forward. One is developer first products and different types of theses. And the second is everything to do with personal data. So that's in a nutshell who I am.
Perfect. Thank you, Marcus. And last but not least, we have our DCTV regular, Noble. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Kent. My name is Noble Dracone. I'm with Dracone Capital Partners. I've been in the tech space since the late 90s, starting off originally when we were converting from paging systems, CDMA, TDMA to CDMA, and growing from there when licenses were sold. So I've been a serial entrepreneur for, I guess we're going on 20 years, as well as a financial expert. I've written 7 books on trading and investing. I've been a regular on Fox Business News. In this iteration, I kind of came back into the startup space when I filed a patent on augmented reality and interactive clothing to create kind of a gaming closed to life model, and just have been sucked back into the whole machine learning focus primarily on visual science, and started a gaming company called Where Play Games. As it evolved, we've teamed up with M Accelerator, which is kind of .LA, which is kind of agnostic in the companies that we bring in on the pre-seed, seed, and maybe early Series A level. So we've covered the gamut from fintech to blockchain, DeFi, as well as contactless food. We just raised $15 million for Bagel Street, which is a contactless pizza company that's debuting in Texas. So as always, I'm happy to be here, Kent.
Perfect. Thank you. So, welcome everybody again. Excited to get this rolling. So let's get started. I remember early in May, there was a couple articles that came out. I think one on DDNet that related that AI and ML investments are going to die during the COVID-19 pandemic, mainly because enterprises are struggling and cutting back spending. But, as the numbers have shown, VC investments still have been very active and companies are kind of, rebounding during the pandemic. Let's look at some different opportunities there are to either invest or build in machine learning or around data right now. Dave, do you have any insights regarding this?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it as the concern point for AI companies is if they're purely about the technology that they're creating, right? So if you think back to the late 90s, early 2000s, in that period of time, I was working at Charles River Ventures, and everything, prior to whatever it was, April 2000, if it had a .com in the end of the name, got funded. And then after that, everything with a .com rebranded itself with something else. And I worked through that cycle with a couple portfolio companies to completely rebrand and refocus, because it wasn't just a throwaway, it was a total giveaway for .com at the time. And then you had to stop and say, gee, is there actually a business here? And we're going through the same thing now, which is for the past few years, if you pull together a good number of really interesting AI PhDs, and you put 5 of them in a room together, you could raise some venture funds and then go sell yourself to one of the big platforms and get a couple $1 million per person. That was easy. Now it's much more about retrenching back to the basics. What's the business? Who's the customer? How are you going to get paid? Is there actually a value here? So I think about it as the AI space is not just, is this a company that has algorithms? It's, is this a company that is using AI well to accomplish a task that other technologies couldn't do? And so is this something that actually brings it together? So when we look at those kinds of companies, I think that they are still quite attractive and they are getting funded. I mean, we're working with companies that are, looking quite good right now. Some have just received some funding and some that are probably on their way to doing that relatively soon. The biggest challenges I think that I've seen are companies that are just a little too me too, which is the same problem as you've had in any downturn. Once there's already some number of companies that does one thing, the 6th, 7th, 8th company in line just isn't compelling enough. And so you're running into a business that's got crowded competition and already has too much capital behind it. As an investor, that makes it pretty hard to get excited about backing the next thing that isn't really that different. One other thing I'd say is I think it's tough for AI companies to express their differentiation because despite the interest from investors, understanding the core technology and understanding how one machine learning algorithm is different or better than the other is really, really hard. So because usually before it's been deployed, it's only the PhDs that can actually tell the difference. And even then they mostly disagree because everybody's got their favorite form of algorithm. And so as an investor, it makes you stop and go, well, I actually want to see whether this works. And I want to see the chain of predictions and actually see if the predictions are actually better than somebody else's. And that makes it really hard to raise money early on. So for us, it's all about what's the customer and the revenue, and are you going after a good market, and are you being smart about using AI, not using the AI as the lead to go raise capital?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are some pretty good insights. Reminds me very much of the blockchain industry in 2017 to 2018, where people are just using the name to raise capital, mostly unwarrantedly. But Noble, I saw you shaking your head very enthusiastically during Dave's spiel there. Would you like to share your thoughts?
No, can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, so the what Dave said is so true, right? We're all headed into Web 3.0, and I think that there's a lot of confusion over what it means to do AI, artificial intelligence, and there's there's so many different iterations between neural networks, machine learning, to the higher levels where you're dealing with really computers that think for themselves. One of the key things that I think that needs to kind of be focused on, and what we really look at, is real world applications. And so we've always focused on visual science components, but that's kind of become kind of like the way things are happening in the background. I mean, it's almost like a given that AI is going to happen. Yelp has already instituted it to go through 10 million 10 billion different photos that they get all the time to figure out what makes sense and what foods are appealing. I don't know if you guys saw, but the Roomba is now going to incorporate components of machine learning built into it, so it could be more effective at determining where it's going to go. I think this idea of parsing it out from practicality, where we're going to have this magnificent AI that's going to run everything, I think that's a second phase. But I think the institution of it in making our devices smarter is really where my attention has been focused. Pinterest is now using forms of AI in order to sell people more stuff and telling them where to go and where to direct them. So there's so much data that we're being inundated with and being collected. It's just, it's a background effect that's going to happen everywhere because human beings can't sort the data. You have to have some logic tree that's going to be able to sort it and then be able to distill it and put it in the right places. So I think you have to get past the buzzword and really get down to what is it that your AI does specifically to solve the problem. It's the same reason why almost any of us invest. What is the problem solution set? And then how are you applying the hammer, right, to build a house? And that's how I really perceive AI in all of its iterations, right? That it's just a hammer. It doesn't really do anything until again, when I learned how to program when I was 8 years old, GIGO, right? Garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't do anything until you're able to apply it to a proper problem solution set. And so, yeah, Dave hit the nail on the head. that it has to have some practical application, and then the explanation has to attach to something that people can comprehend.
Yes, AI is a very powerful tool, and it does allow us to aggregate a lot of data, which may or may not be useful. I secretly think Roomba is a secret ploy to map everyone's house, but that could be a whole different story. Isabelle, do you have any thoughts on the topic? It seems that you are on mute.
Sorry. We're still seeing in our area, we invest mostly in North America. We're still seeing artificial intelligence and machine learning based businesses raising capital at higher rates than other technologies and other industries. But as Dave said, there is certainly a focus on the quality of the technology, because there's a lot of noise now. Everyone has some component of artificial intelligence and machine learning in their business. A lot of it is off the shelf. And as an investor, obviously, we try to focus on companies that have proprietary technologies that are scalable, that are somewhat novel, that will fill a gap. So it used to be 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that investors were more likely to invest in any artificial intelligence company, any machine learning based company. But now there's certainly much more of a focus on quality, even, I would say even more so in the last few months. But again, to echo Dave, it's still hard to assess the quality of the technologies. And so we as investors fill that gap by understanding the applications of the technology and understanding how they speak to customers. So by spending a lot of time speaking to customers and seeing use cases, which makes it that we're less likely to invest at a very early stage because we don't understand it. So however, once we see the applications of it, once we see some traction, some sales, then we're more likely to invest. And that creates an arbitrage opportunity for investors to invest at a very early stage, where you're more likely to get a good valuation if you understand the technology in depth and its possible applications. So that's that discrepancy is very interesting, and it's growing. The arbitrage opportunity is growing because we're seeing companies that use more and more off-the-shelf technologies, and again, as investors, we're looking to access any space that is not getting crowded, and that where the companies will provide a technology that is really proprietary. So I would say in the last few months, that is accelerating, or there's a flight to quality.
I see. Interesting opportunities. Jenny, have you seen any other interesting opportunities in the space?
Yeah, we've seen a few. But maybe just before I mention any examples, I would just like to add to these discussions, because they're really good, that the great thing about AI that might set it apart from all the things that we're looking at right now is that the foundation is really ready. We have the processing power, we have all the data to apply it on, and the foundation is ready. And now it's just about, like you said, Isabelle, to sort of figure out what's noise and what's real, and see the new development of, new things coming out, like explainable AI, which I think is super interesting. And if I just give you an example from the deal flow that we are seeing, there's a company that we invested in called Lucinity. And they are helping banks with anti-money laundering processes, and just processing claims and flagging payments and transactions. The great thing, and I think what they brought really to the table was their experience from working within these processes, working within top tier banks in the US, seeing the whole flow of claims and everything and how it's done today. So they usually call their system like augmented intelligence. They're sort of helping people with their AI to process claims. So it was more so the team experience that we were investing in than the technology, because and even if they have filed IPs and everything on what they're doing, and they have really great data people, I would not say that that's more valuable than really the knowledge of knowing how the ins and outs of these processes work.
Mm-hmm. It seems like, while we gather like all of these, like all this data, all this process, all this noise for all these different types of investments, it's going to boil down to, what separates like these opportunities to be unique. Is there something behind the security of the data, a way the application is? Marat, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think in general we have increasing computing power, and with new advances and chip manufacturing, for example, GraphCore has intelligent processing units. NVIDIA, it's next step forward from NVIDIA, and with all those advances, I think in general, artificial intelligence companies working with ML algorithm will have more solutions. What we see, though, is that for the most part, many companies use the AI as a tool, and it's really difficult and hard to productize the services. Like even the big company Element AI is in Canada here is pretty much a typical service company. They have enterprise customers, but it's not like they have productized services, typical SaaS business, if you will. That's why it's hard to build the companies with a product in mind from the get-go. Having said that, there are a lot of opportunities. For example, Darwin AI, like our portfolio company, they do explainable AI. They look into the black box and they explain why certain decision has been made by a particular algorithm. Because if we're talking about mission critical and we want to make sure that we understand the reason the algorithm made certain decision, want to know want to have a tool that can explain that. So we see that it's an adjacent field in ML and AI and in reinforcement learning that can spin out. Also, like what we think is the biggest impact is when we have not only non-symbolic, like all the algorithms, but symbolic architectures coming up. So we have DeepMind and OpenAI working on non-symbolic representation, but at the same time, SingularityNet and TrueAGI working on symbolic. And that's where we move into the realm of general intelligence, where we can combine all the benefit of using the ML in certain narrow tasks, and then come up with a symbolic representation that we can actually come up with a general intelligence. We're still, a couple of decades away, but according to many, according to Ray Kurzweil, we literally 20 years away from singularity. So it means that for the current progress of computing power and development going on, so we might see big steps in that direction. So I'm pretty excited about AGI space in general than narrow intelligence, because I think it's, as much as it's smart, it's still dumb, because it's optimized the the outcome based on the weights and biases. So, but AGI in general, like we're at the edge of creating quite smart machines, and we might see it in our lifetime.
Awesome. Yeah, it seems like at least in this industry, we moved past like the nascent stage and we're starting to finally see the results as the technology makes all these opportunities possible. Marcus, would you like to share your insights?
Yeah. So many great points by the panelists. So thank you for those. I'm a super practical guy, so I kind of look at this from a couple of different dimensions. One is that I think the two dimensions are that enterprise sales suck, and that's why we love developers. And then we have all of this data, but all of this data is locked away in different silos, and we need to start processing this data closer to where the data actually is. So those are kind of the two dimensions that when we're looking at basically how these projects get to market, we really like the developers first approach, that if developers fall in love with your tools and they can get the use case right, that way they can sell into the enterprise. That's something of a dimension that seems to resonate quite a lot. But then this notion of distributing data, that's also something that we really like for the long term. So not necessarily DLT distribution, but just more data processing close to where the data is, because that seems to also be a very inevitable future. The more data we have, the less we can afford latency and waiting for a server to respond with something. So from a very practical point of view, what this gets us is that we've been involved in different projects where, for example, we have different types of open source tools for developers to optimize checkout in AI, optimize checkout in e-commerce with AI. So for example, that's a company called Morphle that's doing this, very developer first. We have companies that are working on basically low code or no code explainable AI or explainable ML, also developers first. So for example, there's a company called EasyML, which is all about democratizing access to machine learning. So for technical people, there are a lot of developers that are not data scientists. And that's also something that if we think about the future 5 years from now, you shouldn't have to have a stats PhD to actually use ML. That's just ridiculous. So the logic is that if you can kind of democratize access for ML, you can get better apps and better use cases. But a lot of these developer tools, I mean, what the panelists also brought up about use cases, it's absolutely right, that a lot of these, they find interesting niches. And looking at kind of what's happened with COVID, then every single project that we're involved with that has to do with data, they've all been really, really prominent. But the use cases, they've changed. So before it was a lot more about top line forecasting, about new customer segments and so on and so forth. But when the crisis hit, it became much more about like, do we lay off our staff this week or 2 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now? So it became a lot more reactive in the just overall notion. One thing that I will say also as a super interesting data trend overall, because data is obviously the foundation for everything that we're doing in the use case layer, as well as in the AI ML layer, that data at the source or data close to the user, that's something that we're super big believers in. And I think there's one of these interesting notions that's happened in the last, let's say, last year and a half, that with users or individuals being given a lot more authority and ownership over their own data, then it's also allowed basically individuals to become almost invisibly in the market the best source of data. But this data is now, it's still locked away in different types of platforms. Like if you think about consumer data, then I mean, Facebook has tons of data on you, Google has tons of data on you. But this is an area where we think that there's a lot that will come, where individuals actually are able to not only centralize this type of data for themselves, but also developers can access this data directly from the individual. Because that's one of those things that when we think about the data market overall, like right now, it's such a captive market that there are a few companies that have practically a disproportionate amount of data. But at the same time, if you are a developer and you want to use this data, well, you basically have two choices. Like either you start building it up, but that sucks, or then you go work for one of the big guys. But unless you want to work with the NSA, then I mean, you're sort of out of luck. So that's one of those things that we also look as maybe a foundational layer 5 years from now, that as you have these new policies like GDPR and CCPA that are pushing more data to the individual, then can we actually see that type of, let's say, a democratization of data at the foundational level, where you could actually build more of the data market around the individual as opposed to around the big platforms themselves?
Mm-hmm. Those are some interesting points. I really like this thought about how, as the system grows, we need to really consider a lot of like edge computing principles of, handling that data, within the data silos and reducing, the centralization that involves a lot of latency and processing data at a core. But jumping off one of the points that you made is that during, the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of companies kind of had to like pivot a little bit. Noble, we had a discussion about this in a previous episode, about the hospitality industry. Have you seen any like successful or maybe unsuccessful pivots for companies in the data and the ML space?
It's interesting, particularly with people trying to determine, I remember the conversation we had in the hospitality space, but I mean, with using, when you start looking at AI in general, there's so many directions you can go. And I think the biggest pivot, and I guess the most successful pivots that I've seen, has really been in just where we focus with visual science and being able to improve both augmented reality and virtual reality experiences, and improving how you're able to display the data in a visual sense. So and then just capture the data and be able to utilize it in a way that's accessible. Where we're at with the augmented reality and where it's headed in general is refining how both the computers are being able to discover and see images in a way that is near, not there yet, but getting closer to how humans see things, and then being able to translate that into information. And, so, I don't have any particular use case to say the companies that we've seen a bad pivot, but I can say I've been happy with what I've seen, like I said, in the commercial space with the utilization of Yelp taking both the visual science and, as I brought up earlier with the Roomba, changing how it's functioning. And we're looking more and more towards both pre-seed and seed companies that are really focused in that area as well, where they're taking the AI and just making it practical.
Mm-hmm. Dave, you do touch a lot of variety of fields and like different startups. Have you seen any, maybe possibly like pivot or do any adaptive changes during this time?
I haven't really, not necessarily pivots, but a couple of maybe lucky spots, which I think is maybe highlights some of the challenges. So I mentioned we're working on one project in the sports industry, which in some sports would be really tragic right now. Because people aren't able to gather and aren't able to go to the gym in the same way. And so there's a lot of things that are going on in sports that are really problematic. Fortunately, the project that we're involved in is in the golf industry, which is actually one industry that's actually still working, and people are still able to play. So we're hopeful about that as a spot. The other is one that we've been working on in the leadership space, which is a little bit of a pivot in that originally there's a queue in terms of inputting data that can get analyzed by the AI after a meeting is complete. And the idea was that it would obviously be something that was in an in-person meeting. Now, fortunately for this business, they built all of it on Teams. And so that actually and extended into Slack. So that actually works quite well as we moved into the virtual world. So you could think of it a bit as a pivot in that the use case is now tied well to virtual meetings, but the technology that they were building was already positioned well for that anyway. So that's a sort of a fortunate moment for them. So I think that those kinds of transitions are quite helpful. There's certainly other industries that I think are really quite difficult to work in, and this is just. It's one of the downsides is the pandemic hitting different industries in much more difficult ways. And we are working on a project that is more sort of post-COVID in that it's around predictiveness of the effects of pandemics like this. But again, that's another one which is more in response to the whole project came out of the pandemic rather than something that was a pivot prior to.
I see. Jenny, do you have any perspectives on, you do a lot of investments both in the US as well as Europe, as the pandemic is handled, different ways around the world. Have you seen any differences that have occurred?
Between Europe and US?
Yeah, regarding, just the investments in like machine learning or opportunities between these two different regions.
No, not really. I mean, maybe the major challenges that we've been facing during these times are just with teams. Like people are moving between countries. They need to get just back to sort of their running their businesses in new locations. Many went home, early spring this year, and they're sort of setting up operations again in new landscapes. But from a portfolio perspective, I mean, we have a few very good gaming studios in our portfolio, and they have been prospering during these times because people seem to play more video games during COVID. We've also seen with the health tech companies, we thought the pickup would be much faster during COVID. Some have seen a lot of increase, but still we find people sort of changing their ways much slower than we were hoping for within healthcare, and maybe that's just because the problem is so big that it's hard to change processes right now. But the tools are out there to help them, and it's just it's a mindset that needs to change, I think, within healthcare in general. With regards to pivots, I mean, there is one company in our portfolio that's a data company. They offer product analytics. It's called Avo.app. They went through YC and have a really nice product. And that product sort of came out of their own need for product analytics. So they were doing something entirely different before in EdTech and changed over to this. And I think there are a few stories like this within data and machine learning, or with these companies that are focused on data that sort of had the need from a developer perspective or just where they were at, and they came out of that. But general terms, I'm not really seeing any difference. I mean, some VCs are ready to go fully digital, and others were reluctant in the spring. But I think everyone is realizing now that either you just move on and figure out the digital process, or you're missing out on opportunities.
That's a good point. For all of us are familiar, the recent YC demo day was all fully remote this year. So we had like 200 companies, rapid fire, doing their pitches. And it's really changed like how, on the VC side, how we do a lot of investments, due diligence, and that entire flow. Isabelle, has there been any changes on how you do like the investment processes for your firm, or does things still kind of seem like normal except for all through Zoom calls? You're on mute again, sorry.
I'm sorry. There certainly are changes. We're much more diligent, but most importantly, we're making sure to look at industries that are that are relevant, that are cash rich, and that have needs for digital transformation. I only invest in North America to answer your earlier question, but we are seeing a lot of differences in industries here that are lagging behind China, for example, where artificial intelligence and machine learning has a much wider variety of applications across industries. So, I mean, here the applications of AI are widespread, and any almost industry has it, but it's not quite refined yet. So we really try to look at industries where it's relevant. So for example, you know, you can have AI in media, as you mentioned earlier, you know, retail, auto, but we're looking for smart applications in smart and resource-rich industries that will benefit from digital transformation. So you can use artificial intelligence to figure out what your dog is saying when he's barking, but you know, we're trying to focus on industries. For example, the financial industry is our primary focus, but it is still undergoing a digital transformation and still has a way to go here in the US. And it's certainly lagging, so that seeing that lag enables us to see the opportunities ahead of us. So for example, at Magnify, the search engine for financial products and investment platform that I co-founded, we have intrinsically built a machine learning model and artificial intelligence that can tell us about the trends in investments and how investors can benefit from those trends. But what I'm not seeing enough of, and I would like to see in this pandemic, is applications of predictive analytics models for different scenarios. So pandemics, economic downturns, natural catastrophes, these are areas that that should be integrated in any industry. So I mean, there are businesses that focus on that and that have that as core of their operations, like the insurance industry. Obviously, that is core to their business. But I'd like to see more applications that help other industries make swift adaptations. So everyone was surprised by this round of by this catastrophe, financial catastrophe. But if you had this backup plugged into a computer, it could be life-saving for some businesses. And we're particularly interested in B2B companies that service small businesses. So that's something that I'm not seeing enough of, that I would like to learn more about and see more in. I think there are a lot of opportunities, a lot of buyers of that kind of technology application. And then in terms of an evolution, I agree with Marcus. Making it more user-friendly is also a priority, in the way that Apple did with hardware, for example, which was key to success. So making it a goal to widen the realm of buyers, to continue the analogy, it used to be that only nerds and bankers would have smartphones. And you know, now it's by simplifying it and democratizing it, to pick up on the term that was used earlier, you know, the applications are much wider. So we want to make it so that any basic entry-level worker can make that buying decision of machine learning and artificial intelligence models.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the digital transformation side of, you know, working in the supply chain industry. You know, the pandemic really like threw a wrench in everything, and companies really had to figure out how do we adapt, and there was no clear like guidance on, you know, how to transform and adjust to all the new, you know, paradigms that happen in the world. But unfortunately, we're coming to the last, you know, couple minutes of our show today. But I would like to get, you know, last thoughts from each of our panelists, plus the best way to reach out to you from people in our audience, whether they're founders or investors. So Marat, would you like to, you know, to share your final thought and the best way for people to reach you?
Sure. Yeah, I guess just to the to add to the previous topic and a question, nothing has changed in terms of how we do the business. If anything, it makes our processes streamlined. You've done 95% online anyway, so we're quite distributed team, and we realized that we don't even need an office per se. So that was a big revelation for us. In terms of how to get how to contact us, the best way is email. My email is Marat at goodnewsventures.com, or if you send just generic an email at info, yeah, this email goes to all the partners. And if you have an interesting business idea, please do reach out. We invest quite early, pre-seed, seed. So it means that if you post product, sometime pre-product, but if it's an interesting idea, whether it's ML, AI, or any other, a software, we in this ICT sector, please do reach out to us.
Perfect. Yeah, so definitely reach out to Marat and his team. Marcus, any concluding thoughts and best way to reach you?
Yeah, as maybe as a call to action, if we kind of think about the way that we see the future, then one of the things that I'm working on in an operational role is basically user-held data. So that's something that we've been working with over 16,000 developers, not just user-held data, but applications on top of user-held data. So that's as far as go to actions or call to actions go, then we see that the data market in the future is not just going to be distributed, but it's also going to be more equal between more participants. So especially for developers that are looking at building and hacking cool new applications based on vast amounts of data, then check out perfina.com. And that's where also you'll find different developer tools, but also then my contact details.
Perfect. Jenny, thoughts and best way to reach you?
Yeah, so the best way to reach me is just to go to our website, croberrycapital.com. All our emails are there for all partners at the fund, so that's super easy. I mean, last thoughts. I mean, we are also it's business as usual. We're still investing. Our process is also, I think, more streamlined now with the huge pandemic hanging over us. But we are very active and we're looking for opportunities mainly in health tech and fintech during these times.
Perfect. Dave, thoughts and best way?
Best way to find me is through the website getsonder.com or dave@getsonder. Find me on LinkedIn too. Is easy to just reach out. Final thoughts for me is I think that there's still the opportunity to pull a great business together using AI and focusing on the customer. One thing that I didn't mention before that I'm really interested in, I think it was Marcus mentioned low and no code solutions for AI. I'm really I've been spending a lot of time looking at that and interested in those businesses. And for me, this will date me. It takes me back to the days of building authoring tools for the multimedia industry in the early mid 90s. There was a lot that we did back then that I think is pretty applicable to AI, and I'd love to connect with other people who are interested in that because I think it would be a pretty interesting space. So that would be fun to connect on. Thanks.
Awesome. Isabelle, last thought, best way to reach you?
Thanks. Yeah, we're looking at primarily applications in the financial industry, insurance, B2B. We do not do early stage. We do Series A, Series B, but no early stage. But within the financial industry, we're particularly interested in wealth management solutions, but just in general, high quality businesses that are based in the US. And LinkedIn is probably the best way to get a hold of me. Thanks
awesome.
for having me.
No, thank you for having you on the show too, Isabelle. And last, Noble, final thoughts, best way to reach you?
No, I mean, it's good to have these discussions, particularly around AI and machine learning, because I don't think that people are really paying attention at what's happening kind of in the substrate of technology. So, the focus is always on driverless cars and all the big applications, but all that's being powered by machine learning. And so it's it's basically the substrate of what's happening in this, like I said, the Web 3.0. To reach me, it's fairly simple. It's Noble Dracone on LinkedIn, or if people want to reach out to me on Twitter, it's just my last name, Dracone. We like, as everyone knows, we work with them accelerators, so we work with a lot of pre-seed, seed, and pre-series A companies, post-product. And in general, we always have an eye towards anything that deals with visual science when it comes down to either augmented reality or virtual reality. So, and I tend to be agnostic. If the idea is good and the people are good, more importantly, if the people are good, then definitely reach out, and look forward to talking to anyone who's open. And thanks for having me on the show.
Perfect. Thank you, Noble. And also thank you all for joining the show today. My personal plug, best way to reach me, Twitter, first name, last name, Kent Makashima, mostly in the blockchain space, but discussions in supply chain as well as in general VC investments. Again, this was another episode of VCTV. Thank you, audience, for chiming in. If you like today's episode, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe below. But otherwise, we look forward to hearing from you all again.